Ukraine. The Prime Minister has met with his European counterparts and will be meeting President Trump shortly as well. Clearly, there can be no negotiations about Ukraine without Ukraine, and there's a huge amount of work to be done. As the Prime Minister has said, this is an early stage in the process.
Elsewhere, Kemi Badenoch and the government have responded to criticism from the Lady Chief Justice today, with the Conservative Party leader saying that politicians must be able to discuss matters of public importance in Parliament. A government spokesman also said that the Prime Minister has made clear that it is for Parliament to make the laws and for the government to decide policy. The responses come after the head of the Judiciary in England and Wales said earlier today that she's deeply troubled by an exchange at the latest Prime Minister's questions between Sir Keir Starmer and Kemi Badenoch about an immigration tribunal decision. During the exchange, the Prime Minister said a decision allowing a Palestinian family the right to remain in the UK after they applied through a scheme designed for Ukrainian refugees was wrong, and that the Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, had got her team working on closing this loophole. Kemi Badenoch raised the case, describing the decision as completely wrong. The Lady Chief Justice Baroness Carr said it's for the government visibly to respect and protect the independence of the judiciary. And as you've been hearing, a press conference is currently underway on the Toronto plane crash yesterday. Delta Airlines said most passengers in that crash have now been released from hospital. All passengers and crew on a flight that crashed and overturned while landing at Toronto Pearson Airport in Canada have survived. 19 of the 21 passengers taken to hospital have now been discharged, according to the airline. An investigation is now underway, and authorities said Toronto Pearson Airport had experienced 50 centimetres of snowfall in recent days. A total of 20 members of Canada's Transportation Safety Board are at the airport for the investigation. Those are the latest GB News headlines. Now let's go back to Michelle.
For the very latest GB News direct to your smartphone, sign up to News Alerts by scanning the QR code or go to gbnews.com/alerts.
Thank you very much for that. I'm Michelle Dewberry. This is Dewbs & Co. We're with you till 7 o'clock tonight. Alongside me, I've got my panel. If you follow me on Twitter, you must think I'm losing my marbles because I was in my own little bubble then. I was just tweeting, saying, come and watch the programme. Joining me is... And then I realised I was literally on telly, so I didn't get to say who was alongside me. So you might be thinking I'm a bit odd, but look, here they are. I've got Matt Goodwin, the pollster, academic, and GB News presenter alongside him, James Schneider, the former advisor to Jeremy Corbyn. I like you two together.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah,
right.
I do, because you can strap yourselves in, ladies and gents, because I think that we've got some robust, lively debates coming up. A Valentine's special? Well, I don't, if that's what you two want to feel like with each other, that's up to you. Or anything goes in this day and age, doesn't it, ladies and gents? Anyway, look, join the conversation all the usual ways. Email gbviews@gbnews.com. Go to the website gbnews.com/yoursay. Of course, you can tweet or you can X me. Just don't expect me to finish my sentence on Twitter. That's all I would say. But look, lots we need to discuss tonight. That plane crash we've just been hearing about, so very, very odd, isn't it? We'll be following that one with interest, finding out the details as they emerge. But for now, look, let's return to matters here because we all remember the story, very, very peculiar story, of the Palestinian family that essentially had the right of access to the UK using the Ukrainian family scheme. It was debated in PMQs, you might remember, last week. Let's remind ourselves of that.
Mr. Speaker, let me be clear. I do not agree with the decision. She's right. It's the wrong decision. She hasn't quite done her homework because the decision in question was taken under the last government, according to the legal framework of the last government. But, Mr. Speaker, let me be clear. It should be Parliament that makes the rules on immigration. It should be the government that makes the policy. That is the principle, and the Home Secretary is already looking at the legal loophole which we need to close in this particular case.
Well, anyway, now the most senior judge in England and Wales has written a letter to Keir Starmer, essentially saying that she was deeply troubled and that this was unacceptable criticism. She was explaining that actually there's an appeals process if you don't like decisions being made, but to criticise judges' decisions, and of course the judge was named in this case, this judge is arguing puts judges' safety at risk. Where are you, Matt Goodwin?
Well, I think that's ridiculous. I think there's nothing within the rule of law that stops democratically elected politicians or citizens from critiquing decisions that are made, particularly before appeals. And I think there are lots of people watching the reaction of that judge, probably watching this show, thinking they have been deeply troubled by a lot of the things they've seen within the legal system, the constant judicial overreach, the judicial activism whereby lawyers and courts have become increasingly political ever since Tony Blair brought in the Human Rights Act. They've been deeply troubled by the decisions we've seen over the last 2 weeks, Michelle, where we've had a number of foreign national offenders and illegal migrants allowed to stay in the country on spurious terms. And they've been deeply troubled by the two-tier justice that they've seen in this country in recent years. I think fundamentally the legal system is really in a fragile place because it has become, I would argue, overtly political. And when you become political, you're going to get a political response. So I think lawyers, judges, the court should go back to doing what they do, remembering that they are supposed to be neutral institutions, and step back from being as political as they are.
James?
I think Matt is right that politicians should be allowed to criticise the rulings of judges. But I think that exchange in the Commons last week was one of the most shameful things I've seen, to see the leader of the opposition and the Prime Minister basically competing in who can be more outraged at the fact that a family from a shattered land that is a demolition site, according to Donald Trump, where all the people are, there's a plan to expel all of them, how they can compete about how we should be unhospitable to them, I found really quite disgusting, and is so far away from how we rightly dealt with and supported and accepted Ukrainian refugees when their country was invaded. So I think this is it's really shameful for Keir Starmer. It's shameful for Kemi Badenoch. I think it's fine for judges. It's fine for judges to be criticised. But what they were doing there, they were saying that this family of 6, 4 children, treating them with no humanity whatsoever after where they are from has been absolutely obliterated.
Well, let's not make sweeping generalisations. The British people have shown ample humanity to nearly 400,000 refugees since 2021. So first of all, let's just get this thing in. I
didn't say the British people. I said Keir Starmer and Kemi Badenoch.
The second thing
I don't think represent the generosity of our people. The second
thing is, where I agree actually with Keir Starmer, which is a sentence I never thought I'd utter in my life, but where I agree with Keir Starmer and Kemi Badenoch is that this is about the conception of power that we have in this country. Do you think that immigration policy and who comes into Britain and who doesn't should be determined by the British people, or should it be determined by unelected judges who are basically overriding existing programmes, as the judge appears to have done in this case, using a Ukrainian programme in order to fit in refugees from another part of the country and then using the ECHR to back it up. And what people watching this show and out there will be sick of is the way in which so many decisions relating to immigration policy, refugees and our borders are taken by people who have an elitist conception of power, not a conception of power that is rooted in the people who ultimately want less migration, control of our borders, and who feel they've done enough in helping refugees around the world.
So where I agree with Matt Goodwin, again, a sentence I'm not going to say very often, is that most of our laws and the decisions that are taken in the country are not done with reference to the people and what they want. We can agree on that point totally. I think that to particularly single out a family of 6 that have experienced a genocide whose country has been destroyed, it is a demolition zone, in order to posture as being tough on immigration or whatever it is, does not represent what people in this country want. It does not represent our basic human values. And I think it shows a form of racism because it is not treating people who have suffered a terrible fate, the Palestinians, in the same way as we would others, for example, Ukrainians, who, as you rightly say, have been welcomed into this country, and that's a good thing.
So are the UAE and the surrounding states, those states around Israel, are they also racist for not taking in Gaza refugees?
Well, did they take in Ukrainian refugees? I'm saying why is it
always on the British people to save the world?
It's not always on the British people to save the world, but we can act in a decent way. And given that, we have flown more surveillance flights over Gaza that has led to its obliteration than even the US and Israel, that we have sent them arms, that we have supported them diplomatically at every stage at the UN. I think that most people in Britain, and you can see this in polling, you know this is the truth, you are a pollster, support the rights of the Palestinian people, think that an appalling thing has been done to them, do not support our government's complicity in those actions.
People don't support refugees coming from Gaza, much for the same reason that Jordan, Egypt and many other states are very dubious about refugees from Gaza. And let's be frank, because they often hold views and attitudes that are completely incompatible with our way of life.
The reason why Jordan and Egypt are correctly resisting Trump and Netanyahu's ethnic cleansing plan for Gaza is because they know, and they have big Palestinian populations who have been driven out in previous times, that if they leave their homes, if they do not go and rebuild, they will never go back. That land will be permanently taken away from them, whether it is a Riviera in the Trump idea or whether it's Israeli settlements, whatever it is, they will never go back to that land because that is the fate that befell them. Most people in Gaza themselves are the descendants of refugees who were expelled from other parts of historic Palestine. The reason why Jordan and Egypt are under huge pressure from their own populations not to acquiesce to the Trump-Netanyahu deal is because they know that that would make them complicit in ethnic cleansing.
Right, I just want to come in, I just want to make a couple of points. I feel like we've gone off topic slightly. You know, you're obviously saying where's like genocide and all the rest of it, and I know my audience, I know that many of them will be getting in touch now and responding. And at the end of the day, I share your concern about seeing particularly women and children in Palestine being bombed. It's absolutely horrific, and I think any human being would be distressed and touched by that on a human level. But one of the reasons that this whole thing has dragged on and carried on and been the intensity that it has, of course, is because people refuse to give back the hostages. And I think it was only today that there's been rumours of that family, those two little babies, those two tiny little children, and whether or not they will actually ever be seen again alive and returned back alive to their families. So I do just want to present that side of the argument on that one. But what I would say specifically about this Ukrainian family scheme, the fact of the matter was, like it or dislike it, it was a scheme set up for a particular group of people relating to a particular conflict. The issue with this, James, and what I would put to you, is what Keir Starmer was pushing back on and Kemi Badenoch was pushing back on, is if you take a scheme, this time for a Ukrainian conflict, and what you then actually do is allow a loophole in that scheme to basically mean that it's not now specific to Ukrainians. And whether it was right or wrong to, limit it to Ukraine, that's kind of irrelevant because that was the scheme. If you then basically allow any body from any conflict in any place of the world that happens to have a family member in this country to use that scheme to settle, where do you even end up with that? Because there are war zones, unfortunately, all over the world.
So what you started with about the basic humanity, that's my main criticism of Badenoch and Starmer. It's not their specific arguments about a specific refugee channel, which I'll talk about in a second. It is the lack of humanity against people who've had the whole place where they live completely destroyed. And that is the point. Now, on the specific point, can I come to the specific point about the specific Ukraine policy? The problem is that we have no routes for refugees to come to Britain if they have some connection to Britain, other than through the Ukraine scheme and through the Hong Kong scheme. That is the problem that this shows up. It's not that this particular scheme...
That's not the problem, James.
This particular scheme has been as you would argue, misused in some way. The problem is that there is no way for refugees to come to this country in a safe way if they are not from Ukraine.
I'm sorry.
And that...
I'm sorry. Can we just get real for a second? The point about the scheme for Ukrainians and Hong Kongers is that it is a defined scheme for people from those countries. You have so far not said what your upper limit on the number of refugees would be. Michelle is absolutely right in that if this is allowed to stand, it establishes a legal precedent for people to use the Ukrainian scheme to come into Britain. So there are 86 million displaced refugees around the world. What is the upper limit that you would like to set for Britain when it comes to refugees? You talk about humanity. I haven't once tonight heard you say anything about the £15.3 billion this country gives to countries overseas, including Gaza, through international aid. You're acting as though we're this evil regime with no heart whatsoever. We are. It's just that the British people, understandably, are saying they've done enough. 400,000 refugees since 2021.
I think it's amazing that you think that Keir Starmer and Kemi Badenoch speak for the British people. But I'm not saying that the British people have done bad things. Far from it.
What's the limit?
I think that the British... I'll come to that. I think that the British people...
Well, hang on. Get to his point, because I ain't got all day, have I? So he's asking you, what is your...
How many do we take on top of the 400,000 since 2021?
So I think that we should come to an agreement with other countries in the other richer countries.
100,000? 50,000?
Conceivably. It depends what other countries...
Another 100,000 refugees?
Conceivably. It depends,
for how long?
It depends what other countries are doing, and it depends what role that we can play in ending the conflicts that are present. For example, take the conflict in Gaza. We shouldn't be selling them arms. We shouldn't be flying civilians.
Those are separate issues. Let's just focus on the refugee issue.
They're not separate issues. Why do you think they're refugees? They're refugees because they're being bombed. They are being bombed in some part by fighter jets that are in part built here.
Israel...
The surveillance...
I'm sorry, James. Israel did not start this war. This war was started when a neighbouring regime invaded...
What happened on what was happening on the 6th of October?
Hamas
what was happening on the 5th of October?
Israel.
What was happening on the 4th of October?
You want to talk about women and kids? We start talking about the women and kids massacred on the 7th. This is such a skewed interpretation of what's happened.
No,
to go back to the question of what is taking place with the judge and this decision, we've taken 400,000 refugees since 2021. Brits out there will say, we've taken enough. We can help through humanitarian aid and foreign aid, but we've taken our fair share. And to be frank, the reason they're comfortable with Ukrainians and Hong Kongers, I would suspect, is because unlike refugees from Gaza, OK, large majorities of those refugees aren't supporting a fanatical Islamist terrorist organisation like Hamas, which all the surveys and polls from Gaza shows is the case. I think we've got enough of those in our country already, to be frank. We don't need another 100,000 of them.
Look, I do just have to come in. A government spokesperson has said the Prime Minister has made it clear that it is for Parliament to make the laws and for the government to decide policy. Where the law is not working as we think it should be, the government will take action to tighten up the rules, and that is what we are doing. As a former Chief Prosecutor, the Prime Minister's respect for the Judiciary, the role that they play in our democracy and the rule of law is beyond question. What do you make to it all? Final say, as always, goes to you at home. Coming up, Kemi Badenoch, she's having a bit of a hard time of it. She's under pressure now for a speech that she gave yesterday, saying essentially that Western civilization is under threat. Let's look at that.
I'm Christopher Hope. From pop stars to politicians, I'll interview anybody in a pub who's got a political opinion. Join me every Friday on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube or gbnews.com, or wherever you get your podcasts. This is GB News, the People's Channel.
We're proud to be GB News, the People's Channel. And as you know, we always love to hear your views. Now, there's a new way of getting in touch with us at gbnews.com/yoursay. By commenting, you can be part of a live conversation and join our GB News community. You can even talk to me, Bev Turner, or any of the members of the GB News family.
This is GB News, Britain's news channel.
Now, a new study has called calorie-labelled menus in restaurants a cause for concern for those who suffer from eating disorders.
It has indeed. The review found that people with restrictive eating disorders modified their behaviour when presented with the labelled menus and opted for lower-calorie dishes. Well, joining us now is content creator Adelaide Saywell. Adelaide, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Now, I know that you yourself have struggled with eating disorders over the years, and that is what's led you to kind of advocate using your online platform to try and help other people who might be struggling. Do you want to just talk to us a little bit about your story first of all?
Yeah, so I've had an eating disorder since I was younger, and it's kind of flip-flopped between anorexia, bulimia and binge eating disorder. And it was in 2020 that I was officially diagnosed with anorexia, and I started my recovery on the 1st of May of that year. Recovery was really, really difficult. It took me, I'd say, at least a year or two before I really went into recovery for the right reasons. I was kind of in like a quasi-recovery where you're like 1 foot in, 1 foot out. And because it was during 2020, it was obviously during COVID, so I didn't have as much support as I could have had, and I had to have therapy, but I had to have it like over Zoom, so they wasn't able to really like talk me through and see me and things like that, which made it really difficult, and not allowed visitors. So it was quite isolating and lonely, which made it even more difficult, and things ended up getting a little bit worse before they started to get better.
GB News, the People's Channel.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens.
With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK,
we're ready to keep you up to date with what's happening every half an hour, every single day. Bulletins here on GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Dewbs & Co. with me, Michelle Dewberry, James Schneider and Matt Goodwin. I've got to say that question, and it is an age-old question, isn't it, when anyone supports very much more safe and legal routes when it comes to migration and refugees. What limit then? At what point? How many war zones? That is the point that's coming through thick and fast, echoing your question there to James. I mean,
what's the limit? That's the question. That's the question that should be asked on everything from refugee numbers to immigration policy to whenever someone says legal and safe routes. What's the limit? Because they never have an upper limit.
Do you have an upper limit?
I think it should be decided democratically. I think.
Well, OK, the polling is showing 75% of Brits say less immigration, please. Can we give them what they're asking for?
But when
I don't see why not. I'm not arguing against that. I don't think that people. I think people should have a democratic say. And on the refugees, which is distinct from migration. So what question would you put to them?
Because I'm assuming you mean a referendum. So what's the succinct question? If you're saying democratically, let's decide a maximum level or whatever, what's your question on your referendum then?
So on my non-refugees, on migration, I would have a system where you have bilateral agreements with countries.
No, what's your question on your referendum?
It's not a referendum. The way in which I would do it is not a referendum.
They wouldn't put it to a referendum because they'd lose a referendum.
No, Matt, you might actually agree. The process I'm setting out is a democratic process, right? I'd have bilateral agreements with countries, reciprocal, so that we can go there and have full rights for a year, and some of their people can.
Oh yeah, great, because I'm desperate to go to Afghanistan for a year. Yeah, lovely.
Just have a summer in
Gaza,
Gaza,
number might be very small than that's negotiated, and then
Christmas in Gaza.
And then this is. I'm not talking about refugees. I'm talking about migration, and then there should be an annual fee for the work permit, which is set by Parliament, and that is the way in which you increase or decrease the numbers. And I think that is a perfectly reasonable way to have a democratic decision about economic migration.
What you was talking, but you weren't talking about economic migration.
Now we can talk
about humanitarian.
Now we can talk about asylum seekers.
So what would you do with that?
I think we could set numbers through Parliament. You could have specific bills for specific conflicts. we should also be trying to reduce the number of refugees through some actions we can take. But yes, I am not scared about asking people about this stuff. Why shouldn't we? I don't want an undemocratic system. I just think that in the case of refugees, most people in this country would be receptive and generous to people that have fled war and persecution, because we have for like loads of our history. That's what happened.
Okay,
that's how my great-grandparents came here. That's how, as Matt was just praising, 400,000 people have come here from Ukraine and Hong Kong.
Yeah, we also have something called a cost of living crisis and an economy that isn't working. And my frustration with hearing the endless appeals to humanity is you act as though the British people don't have a heart, and they have an enormous heart.
No,
there is a thing.
No, Matt,
sorry,
I just said
James,
the opposite.
There is a thing in this country that is called the British sense of fair play. And the reason, if you look at the polling, the reason reform is surging, the reason the Tories are collapsing, the reason Keir Starmer and your beloved Labour Party are
it's
declining.
not my beloved Labour Party.
OK, well, the reason Jeremy Corbyn got smashed partly is because the elite in this country have never understood what the forgotten majority in this country want, which is lower levels of migration, high-skilled migration from culturally compatible countries, not from, countries outside of Europe, and forms of migration that actually grow our economy, but very limited migration, not 1 million people net, plus 400,000 refugees on top. Let's start being respectful of the British people.
What do you think to some of those solutions? Maybe you are somebody who sits there and says, you know what, I'm traumatised by seeing all of these conflicts and their innocent victims, and I would welcome and I would open my doors to people in those areas. What's your plan then? Would you have schemes in all the different war zones in the world? How would you ensure integration and so on and so forth? Because it's all well and good, isn't it, being theoretical on some of this stuff and leading with our hearts, but when it comes to practicalities, that's what I want to try and get to the bottom of, so tell me your thoughts on that. Look, coming up after the break, there's lots we need to discuss. Kemi Badenoch's speech, did you see that? She is under fire for what she had to say. Also, we talk about the breakdown of law and order and many aspects of the fabric of society, don't we, often on this programme. Well, what is the answer? What is the solution? One headmaster, I'll be talking to him after the break. He's got some quite radical ideas. He's managed to upset a lot of people, which means often you're on the right track. Let's see whether or not he can actually start to fix law and order, respect and boundaries and discipline in this country. I'll see you in 2.
I forecast a perfect holiday in the sun.
Weather looking good then?
For sure, and no worries about our travel insurance.
All Clear Travel Insurance sponsors GB News Travel Destinations forecast.
A brisk wind continues to blow over the Canaries, but it will be easing as we head through the latter part of this week. Still a few showers across Spain and Portugal. They will also be fading. Much of the east coast of Spain seeing plenty of sunshine along with the Balearics and Sardinia, but a few scattered showers over southern parts of mainland Italy, and looking fairly showery in Greece once more. And with the winds coming down from the north, it is chilly and, if anything, getting colder in Santorini through the rest of this week. Goodbye.
All Clear Travel Insurance sponsors GB News Travel Destinations forecast.
Hello again and welcome to the latest update from the Met Office for GB News. Big changes on the way for the UK's weather during the next 24 hours. It's dry for most at first with clear spells and chilly at first, but then it turns much milder through Wednesday night and into Thursday as Atlantic-driven weather starts to arrive. That weather will turn things more unsettled, but also much less cold compared with recent weather. We've still got the cold air in place though on Tuesday nights and certainly through Wednesday morning with some clear spells, and where we've got some shelter from the wind, there'll be a patchy frost to wake up to across central and eastern parts of the UK. A bright start though for many. However, the southwest, South Wales, parts of Northern Ireland we'll see a milder start to the day. Certainly for Cornwall, it's very mild to begin things, but it's also wet as a band of heavy rain moves through. That's pushing into Devon, Somerset, Dorset by 7 a.m, into Wales at this stage as well as Northern Ireland. It's accompanied by a strengthening wind, and that wind will affect much of the UK. It will also tend to thicken up the cloud through Scotland with a few spots of light rain around first thing Wednesday. But the brightest skies will be through the Midlands, the east and southeast of England, where there will be some glimmers of sunlight through the morning and early afternoon before this system moves eastwards. That's going to bring thicker cloud and some light rain and drizzle, but it tends to peter out by the afternoon. Brighter skies for a time towards the southwest, and it's in the southwest where we're going to see that mild air make inroads. 13 Celsius, for example, in Exeter, whilst it stays just 5 or 6 across eastern parts of the country. But by Thursday, we're all in the mild air, and that means a frost-free start to the day, but it's also going to be a very lively start with strong winds and heavy rain, even some thunderstorms around. The wettest weather first thing in the north and west, that clears east. Some brighter skies follow, but the weather's going to be very unsettled, very changeable through Friday and the weekend. Further rain and strong winds at times, but mild with it as well.
The latest GB News travel.
Good evening, I'm Johnny Ratner. There are long queues heading south down the M6 towards Birmingham tonight. Everyone's been funnelled into the inside lane of 4 from junction 7 to 6 after a lorry broke down just north of Spaghetti Junction. Long queues back to the M5 and the opposite way and back onto the A38M into Birmingham city centre, watching the cameras. On the M1 in Bedfordshire, the 2 inside lanes of 4 are blocked off southbound just after the Dunstable Northern bypass, junction 11A. Of course, there's a collision being investigated. In Worcestershire, the A449, that remains closed on the Kidderminster Road, just north of Kidderminster, following an accident. And the M32 is really slow heading south towards Bristol. A lane's closed on the entry slip road at junction 3, the St Paul's turn-off, where a car has broken down. And in East Sussex, north-east of Heathfield, the A265 at Burwash Common stays closed after power cables came down. That's the latest.
You can stay up to date throughout the day by visiting our website, gbnews.com.
Hello there, I'm Michelle Dewberry. This is Dewbs and Co with you till 7. Alongside me, Matt Goodwin, the Polestar academic, GB News presenter, and master of many things, I've got to say. Alongside him, I've got James Schneider, the former advisor to Jeremy Corbyn. He just said he was most offended.
And master of many things as well.
You're also
international chess player.
International. Oh yes. Yes, I forget that about you, that you are a chess player. There you go. That's how we can thrash things out one of these days. We'll settle our differences with a game of chess. But look, speaking of differences, Kemi Badenoch has managed to upset people again. I mean, when does she not? I think you've got to have a very thick skin to be in politics this time. She gave a speech yesterday at a conference called ARC. I've got to say, one of the investors of ARC. It's a great conference. He is also an investor at GB News, and it was a very interesting speech that she gave, did Kemi. It said many things that have caught the attention of people, not least that Western civilization is in crisis. We face existential threats from the left. It goes on and on that apparently we've got an embarrassment of the West's legacy, a hatred of our history and our culture, and so on and so forth. Matt Goodwin, where are you?
I don't think what she said is controversial at all. I think we've heard a lot of that before. Look, my view about Kemi Badenoch's speech, I think she needs to move on from this script, the kind of anti-woke, anti-immigration, kind of pro-West narrative, because we've been hearing this for 5 years from lots of different people, from Donald Trump, from new media, from lots of, interesting thinkers, right? What I want to hear from Kemi Badenoch is policy. What are you actually going to do to change this country, OK? Because you can wax lyrical about judges and immigration, but if you're not going to say and commit unequivocally to leaving the European Convention on Human Rights, if you're not going to commit unequivocally to overturning the Blairite legacy, the Human Rights Act and the legislative foundation that Blair left, what's the point, right?
But hang on, do you say the same about Reform UK?
No.
Where's your policy?
Well, hold on a second. I'm saying that we're at a point now where the Conservatives are not just on life support, they are heading to the morgue. They're on 21% on average in the polls. Some polls have them down at 18%. Kemi Badenoch's ratings are going the wrong way. So she needs to get policy on the table. We need to know what she wants to do. And the second brief thing, if I can, what her critique was at this conference, a very important conference, right? What her critique was actually about liberalism. She was not making the case for conservatism. She was critiquing the liberal consensus. Now, fine, OK, but who's actually going to make the case for conservatism? That's the question I would be asking Team Badenoch.
James?
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was sort of deluded and wrong. I mean, the deluded part is she's the leader of the third most powerful party that's so far up Donald Trump's behind that, can probably see if they're polyps or something like that, and no one particularly cares for the reasons that Matt was saying. I think Matt's points about her not making her positive case, only her negative case, is quite good. But when we're talking about Western civilization, we should know what the code is. They don't mean, our books and our art and our culture and the great things that we might have done collectively. It basically means US imperial interests. It means doing what the US weapons company and big oil.
I don't think that's what Kemi Badenoch actually means.
That's what it ends up meaning. And to be honest, I don't want to continue to be. I mean, we already are. I don't want to continue to be a kind of appendage of the US. I want to be an independent country. I want to. Matt, you might be shocked to learn I want to be a much more democratic country where people get much more of a say. And all of this sort of making us an appendage of the US, it just takes us further down the route, where there's money for war, but we can't feed the poor in the world.
Yeah, OK. In fairness, I don't think anybody, either Kemi Badenoch or anybody at that conference or within this debate over Western civilization is saying that. People have also talked about defending women's rights, their biological rights, for example, revising our curriculum so we don't indoctrinate kids with these ridiculous ideas that little girls can become little boys and little boys can become little girls, actually believing that there's more to Britain than actually just what happened in the slave trade and ignoring all the contributions we made to eradicating that, having a very different, dare I say, even positive view about our contribution to human civilization. I think what a lot of people are saying, Kemi Badenoch included, Nigel Farage and others, Donald Trump, they're saying the left, as in where you are, your group of people, went so insane over the last 15 years that you completely lost touch with the average voter. That's why Corbyn got smashed. That's why Kamala Harris got smashed. That's why leftists across Europe are getting smashed, because you presented this crazy worldview that the average voter looked at and said, sorry, I don't even find this remotely convincing or appealing. And the end result is what you see now. Donald Trump, Alternative for Germany, Georgia Maloney, that's the reality.
When Kemi Badenoch and other politicians like her are talking about defending Western civilization, they are not talking about giving more time for ordinary people to spend with their families. They're not talking about putting more money in people's pockets.
Well, she's talked a lot about the rights of family and childcare.
And they're not talking about reining in the super rich who are sucking out the wealth from ordinary people's pockets day after day after day. What they end up doing is saying, we need to spend more on war because Donald Trump told us to. That's what it comes down to. It comes down to...
I don't think I heard her say that at all.
Of course, I'm saying that's what it comes down to. Whenever it's saying we need when we need to defend Western civilization...
Where's all this war?
When we need to defend Western... Well, we're already increasing... spending to 2.5%. Keir Starmer's saying it's going to go to 2.65%.
The only person who's talking about ending war is Donald Trump.
We have participated... Yeah, I'm talking about Britain. I'm talking about British politicians.
Yeah.
And when they are talking about... My point to people out there is when they're talking about Western civilization, they are not talking about our lives. They are talking about a military alliance that is subservient to the interests of the US elite, the US corporate elite, who have no interests the same as us at all.
J.D. Vance was very clear when he went to Munich, was a few days ago, maybe last week. He didn't actually talk about the military-industrial complex. He talked about, get your act together, Europe, in terms of free speech. Get your act together in terms of mass immigration. And the point he made was very important. Samuel Huntington wrote a book in 2001, and he asked the question, who are we?
The Clash of Civilizations.
No, after that, who are we? About national identity. And he made the important point. He said, in the West, our national identities are not only being eroded by things like mass immigration, they're being eroded by an elite that no longer identifies with their own country. And what J.D. Vance and Trump have said to Europe this week, I think is very significant. They've said it's not just that you need to increase defence spending, and it's not just about war and conflict and so on, because if anything, they're trying to end war in Ukraine. What they said is, You need to start defending the values that make us distinctive as a culture and a civilization, and I would suggest make us the greatest civilization that's ever existed, because Europe has completely forgotten about those things. When I see a guy in Germany, like the leader of a security conference, right, crying his eyes out because J.D. Vance has dared to suggest that Europe doesn't actually have itself together, that is weakness. China, Russia, the Islamist regimes love that because it shows everything that they suspect about Europe. Our leaders, the leaders of our civilization, have lost touch with what makes that civilization great. Our values, commitment to free speech, free expression, believing in the nation state, believing in sovereignty, believing in our own people, and having controlled borders.
Our leaders have allowed, for more than 40 years, for most people to be ripped off, to have deindustrialization, for living standards to be falling, for there to be less future now than for the generation beforehand. Yes, that's what they've done. But that isn't because they haven't, I don't know, appropriately said, no, actually the British Empire was fantastic and we didn't actually genocide anybody, or, you know, whatever it is that, that you might say. It's because we live in an extremely undemocratic system where we don't control most of the things which our government does, which means that we don't control our economy, which means that year on year, the rich get much, much richer, and overall, as an aggregate, most people get worse off. James, that is the problem with our ruling. And none of these politicians who are saying we need to reconnect or whatever, none of them say, and do you know what we're going to do? We're going to take on the rich and powerful forces which have all of the money and put more money in your pockets. They never say that because they're paid for by those people.
Well, I have a lot to say, but I don't know. You're giving me a little look here, Michelle, as to. But look, just briefly, then, if I'm allowed to come back on that, I agree with you that our democracy needs to be more rooted in the people, and it needs to be more accountable. Everybody watching this show, I think, would agree with that. Too many quangos. That's why we left the European Union. It wasn't democratic, and it was a concentration of power that Brits looked at and they didn't find natural. But where you and I differ is that I also believe that making democracy accountable applies to some of the biggest issues of our time, including migration, including borders and security.
I think it applies to everything.
And what J.D. Vance has said and what Donald Trump have said, and what the left across Europe hasn't realised, is we are now in an entirely new zeitgeist, a new spirit of the age, in which there is a reset going on. And the reset is away from the liberal consensus that dominated the last 30 years into what we might call a post-liberal consensus, which will become, I think, the dominant view in the West, whereby we're saying we're not just going to have universal liberalism imposed on everybody else. We're not going to have borders eroded. We're not going to have this endless repudiation of everything that is great about the West. We're going to defend who we are and what we're about. I think that's a welcome break from the last 30 years.
Well, there you go. What do you think to that? We just mentioned there Munich's security conference that took place and the crying. This is the chair, essentially, of that conference. Watch.
After the speech of Vice President Vance on Friday, we have to fear that our common value base is not that common anymore. Let me conclude, and this becomes difficult.
I mean, what do you even say to that?
Can I just say one quick thing, Michelle? There's a great quote by Toynbee, and he says, civilizations, they don't die through murder, they die through suicide. That's what I thought when I watched that.
I wonder what he thought the next day when he woke up and looked back on himself. I would have been absolutely mortified if that was me. I think it's absolutely absurd. What do you think to it all? Coming up after the break, we've just been speaking about Trump and Vance. Do we need then a little bit more of, you know, the dirge, the slashing, the cutting that's going on there, the optimism, I would actually say, the shaking up of a new dawn? Do we need that here?
This is Britain's Newsroom, where your voice matters.
It's just astonishing. With expert analysis and honest opinion, we don't just keep you informed.
We bring you unique perspectives you won't see anywhere else.
Can't argue with any of that. When the news happens, it happens here.
On Britain's Newsroom, weekdays from 9:30 a.m.
Only on GB News.
Sunday with Michael Portillo from 11, only on GB News.
A new study has found that almost 8 in 10 of Gen Z Brits believe that the romantic poems of Shakespeare, Keats, Barrett Browning and the rest are outdated and irrelevant. Can we re-engage youngsters with such verse? Can the Gen Z audience become infatuated with love poetry? Joining me now is the Professor and Chair of English at the University of Virginia, Andrew Stauffer. Andrew, welcome to GB News. Good to see you.
Good to see you, Michael. Thank you for having me.
What is it that a poet does with language and in love, with language and with love, to express love better than any other way in which it can be expressed?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it is, it's relying on language as being the primary way that we get in touch with our feelings, that, poetry is the language art par excellence. And so it's the assumption that the more we can use our words to talk about our feelings, the deeper, more pleasurable, more available those feelings actually are to us. And so in a certain way, reading poetry, not only we recognize our feelings, we even catch feelings from art, from poems, from songs, from stories. There's a way that even our own most personal relationships are structured by the culture that we have grown up in and that we've been immersed in. And so it really can be an aid, or at least a transformative experience to encounter language, to give yourself words for your own very private feelings that turns out have been felt by other people going all the way back to Sappho and Catullus and Horace and through Shakespeare and through the whole English tradition. So that can be galvanizing as well, really kind of eye-opening to know that you're not alone in your feelings.
GB News, the People's Channel.
Headliners on GB News 11 p.m. every night. It's got 3 top comedians going through the next day's newspapers so you don't have to read them, which is great.
That's a good point. He's lying. I mean, maybe he's not lying.
That's Headliners every night from 11 p.m. and 5 a.m. as well on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Nana Okoye, for an informative, interactive news programme with a difference. It's fun.
No, you didn't say that, Dave.
I'm so surprised.
I think there's an element of truth to that.
Join me from 3 p.m. every weekend, only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Hello there, Michelle Dewberry, Matt Goodwin, James Schneider with you. Jeff, you've been in touch saying you're watching from Western Australia. We appreciate that. It's almost 3 o'clock in the morning there.
Good day, mate.
Vacation. Yeah, we like that. Anne has been in touch saying, Michelle, I have never messaged into your show before, but I'm so wound up, I've got to do it tonight. You're very welcome, Anne. She goes on to say that she and her husband run a small business. They're really struggling. You say it's thanks to the anti-business Labour Party. They're now considering retiring early, and she says, but actually they're now looking at moving abroad. Yeah. She says, we wish that we had a government in this country who could strive to put the great back into what was once Great Britain. You lead me nicely to my next topic then, Anne, because one of the things that I want to explore, we've seen all of the stuff that Elon Musk and Donald Trump are doing in America, not least with what they call the DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency. There's lots of talk about whether or not we should have something similar here. Yvette Cooper has now set up a unit to try and combat waste in the Home Office. Does it go far enough? Do we need to do more? And do we need this kind of radical shake-up here, Matt?
So here's where I feel like I'm losing touch with everybody in this DOGE debate, this Department of Government Efficiency. Like, why wouldn't you want to make government more efficient? I don't understand. This is not radical to me. So we had the National Audit Office last year that found out, according to a report by our own National Audit Office, that somewhere between, and get ready, these numbers are enormous, that somewhere between 51 billion and 81 billion pounds in this country has been lost to fraud and waste. OK, so if you're saying to me, do we need a unit that actually looks at all of this wastage, from our asylum system to NHS diversity officers putting up, lists of 72 genders in toilets rather than actually helping British people who are being treated in hospital corridors and car parks, like, I'm all for having a UK DOGE, because fundamentally, and maybe where James and I would depart from one another, I don't know, but I think the state, from Southport to the rape gangs, to the cost of living crisis, to inflation, has consistently shown itself to be incompetent, to be overloaded, to be inefficient. And the idea, by the way, just while I'm here, that the state can also oversee assisted dying is for the birds. You know, if it can't even figure out what's been going on with things like the rape gangs and the cost of living crisis, but let's park that there. Yes, we need a UK Doge. We need it to be big, organised. We need a serious counter-elite to be running it. And, yeah, what's not to like about it?
What's not to love about that, James?
I think Yvette Cooper's little version of it is pretty embarrassing because it's not the thing that Matt just said. And there are other models that you can come from the left, where you go in, like Mexico with Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who came in with the idea of Republican austerity, which was to cut all the fat and the corruption that there is in the state from the top, and businesses leeching, big businesses leeching off it, and senior civil servants on very large amounts of money. And it was tremendously popular. And I'd like to see something like that here, because we all know, OK, you quoted the National Audit Office figures, which are extremely alarming. Everybody knows, from the COVID contracts to the rip-off of water privatisation, to the big outsourcing companies that are taking things away, to PFI contracts, to the corporate capture of writing our laws. You know, you said earlier we have a cost of living crisis. Of course, it's in part a cost of greed crisis. There's price gouging.
I agree with you on all of that.
I know.
I agree with you on all of that.
And what is so pathetic and disappointing about this little, like, I'm going to get a headline in the Mail by saying we're going to do a Doge thing where we're looking at, whether the paper clips have been done properly in the department, when billions and billions and billions of pounds of our money is being siphoned off to the richest and most powerful people. And as a government, we don't have a government that says we're going to go and get back some of that money. And that's what we should have, but we don't.
So on a more... I agree with you on that. The one issue where perhaps we disagree on the Yvette Cooper, let's have Doge. Here's an idea. The Home Office have just given £100 million to a new contract to basically turn a site into a new camp for illegal migrants, and another £100 million on top of that to service that site, to provide food and services and all the rest of it, like, accommodation. Mm-hmm. If our leaders actually had the guts and the courage to do what is needed to be done in order to protect our borders, which includes leaving the ECHR and reforming the Human Rights Act, there's a great initiative for a UK Doge which could say, well, let's save £5.5 billion that we're currently spanking on our border policy, which doesn't make any sense. And the reason we're not fixing that is exactly the reason we're now spending £200 million on this site. And Yvette Cooper's the person who comes forward and says, hey, let's save some money. It's completely insane.
But what kind of person then should be drafted in to do all this stuff? Should it be like an Elon Musk type entrepreneur?
Elon Musk. We need a counter-elite in this country. We need a counter-elite that is not loyal to Westminster.
So give me a name then. Who?
Matt Goodwin. Two words. There you are. Unfortunately, I'm a GB News presenter and I'm incredibly loyal to this channel, but maybe I could do two things at once. But in all seriousness, we need a counter-elite that is not loyal to Westminster, is drawn from outside of politics, is not tainted by Labour and the Conservative Party. We need public servants who believe in Britain, are loyal to the country, and I will agree with James, not drawn from the upper echelons of business, but people who are brought in with a specific mission to reform and smash this oligarchy, which I agree with you does exist.
I think you need people like my old boss, Alan Sugar. I do. I think he would be able to come in, yes, as a successful businessman.
I'll tell you who would be good. I'll tell you who would be good.
Who? Are you going to say Michelle Dewberry?
I was going to say somebody like Martin Lewis.
Yeah, that was exactly the
somebody who is not loyal to any of the parties, but who is on the side of consumers, but who has a team around him of Matt Goodwins and Michelle Dewberry. Unfortunately, James, you didn't make the cut. Who can advise him?
Why don't you want to deal with PFIs? Why don't you want to deal with COVID contracts? Why don't you want to deal with what happened to all of the money that we printed in the pandemic?
Oh, go on then. Let him in. We'll have one lefty.
One.
We'll make you a DEI.
The thing is, I have far less connection, I would imagine, to big corporate interests, and we should have people who have got, far less connection to big corporate interests, because we're far more likely to be able to say, no, actually, this is dodgy. They're taking money.
And like lots of lefties, you have a lot of time on your hands.
I'm actually very busy.
I've got to say, Anthony says, Michelle, you're all talking about big corporates getting all the money. It's barristers and lawyers that seem to be rubbing their hands and coining it in this day and age, says Tony. I hear you. Margaret says, you don't need Dodge or Dirge. She just says you should just sack everybody. But Maggie, you can't just sack everybody. I mean, I like your style, but I mean, what on earth would happen if we just did that? Look, my headmaster, he got stuck on a bus. I'll try and bring him in tomorrow because he is very interesting. But for now, that's all I've got time for. Gents, thank you. Thanks to you at home. Have a good night. I'll see you tomorrow night.
We'll see a cold snap, which will quickly develop into a warm front. Boxed Boiler Repairs, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hi there and welcome to the latest update from the Met Office for GB News. We've seen some rain and hail snow across Scotland earlier, but that's now petering out, so a dry end to the day for many of us with a few clear spells, leading to another chilly night for most, before, over the next few days, we see a return to milder, albeit wetter, Atlantic-driven weather. For the time being, that weather's staying to the west, and we've still got a cold southeasterly wind. Because it's a breezy night, we won't see a widespread frost, but there will be a patchy frost across some central and eastern parts of the country. A chilly start to Wednesday. Some bright spells first thing, but also a lot of high clouds, so any sunshine tending to be hazy. And as we start off, well, Northern Ireland, South Wales, southwest England, soon sees a return to some wetter weather. Heavy rain moving through Cornwall first thing, pushing into Devon, Somerset, Dorset by mid-morning, as well as parts of Wales and Northern Ireland. That wet weather will be lasting an hour or two before it moves eastwards. And just ahead of it, we've got a thickening of the cloud across Scotland, so some light spells of rain across western and southern Scotland. But the brightest weather, northeast Scotland, southeast England, where this cold southeasterly wind continues to blow. Now, through the day, the rain in the west moves its way east and north. It tends to become more showery and lighter, could give a few flakes of snow over the hills to the north of the central belts. But it does dry up in its wake, and it's going to be very mild in the southwest, 12 or 13 Celsius, whilst it stays rather cold in the east, although temperatures recovering compared with recent days. The truly mild air that we're seeing in the southwest on Wednesday afternoon becomes widespread later Wednesday and into the start of Thursday, accompanied by spells of rain. That rain heavy at times, and we'll see further wet and windy weather through Friday and the weekend.
A nice bright morning will generate a lovely warm day, right through to the evening. Boxed Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.